Washington would love to hide the real cost of its ultimatums. But the numbers don't lie. April 13th, 2026. 21 hours of brutal negotiations in Islamabad and total collapse. That same day, Viktor Orbán loses his election in a landslide, right after J.D. Vance personally flew in to campaign for him. And now the United States is hunting down the commercial fleets of its own allies. So what does any of this have to do with Taiwan? This is how the American century ends, not with a war, with an ultimatum that nobody accepted. This is the anatomy of ultimatum politics, where one administration's attempt to monetize chaos brought the entire global economy to the edge of collapse. Let's start in that conference room in Islamabad. The stakes? Nothing less than the future of global energy transit. What did Washington want? Complete Iranian capitulation, dismantling of nuclear facilities, an end to proxy support across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and permanent free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. What did Tehran want? Sanctions relief, security guarantees, recognition as a regional power. What did either side actually offer? Ultimatums. Here's what most analysts missed about Islamabad. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a performance of dominance, and it backfired spectacularly. The American delegation arrived with a list of demands and a deadline. The Iranian delegation arrived with something far more dangerous, a backup plan. Within hours of the collapse, Tehran announced a new toll system, $1 per barrel of oil, or up to $2 million per vessel, payable in rials or yuan, not dollars. This isn't just about Iran charging transit fees. It's about Iran proving it can charge transit fees, and that China will happily pay them. It's about building a parallel financial architecture that cuts the United States out entirely. The American response? Hunt down anyone who pays. Trump's exact words. Nobody who pays the illegal toll will get safe passage on the open sea. World extortion must end. Think about what that actually means. U.S. Navy vessels are now authorized to intercept, board, and detain commercial ships, including those belonging to NATO allies, Asian partners, and neutral nations, in international waters. Not because those ships broke American law, not because they threatened American security, but because they paid a fee to pass through waters America does not control. Here's where it gets genuinely absurd. The U.S. Navy is now chasing down tankers belonging to Saudi Arabia, theoretically one of America's closest partners in the region. Washington has gone from guarantor of freedom of navigation to its primary threat. As of mid-April, over 600 vessels are trapped in the Gulf. Brent crude has stabilized above $100 a barrel, and the most powerful navy in history has become a pirate fleet hunting its own friends. There's a deeper irony here that almost no one has pointed out. America's vaunted submarine fleet, those massive Ohio-class and Virginia-class nuclear boats, has proven nearly useless in this conflict. These vessels were engineered for deep ocean warfare against peer competitors. In the shallow, cluttered waters of the Persian Gulf, they're essentially blind. Meanwhile, Iran's small diesel-electric submarines simply rest on the seabed, invisible to sonar, turning the entire Gulf into a minefield. The world's most expensive naval technology, defeated by geography and creativity. Europe refused to send minesweepers. The United States is alone in a sea full of mines. Its multi-billion-dollar submarines circling uselessly while Iranian speedboats dart through the shallows. This is the Islamabad paradox. The attempt to project overwhelming strength exposed overwhelming vulnerability. Now let's talk about money, because at its core, this story is about money and what money can and cannot buy. On April 3, 2026, the Trump administration released its budget proposal for fiscal year 2027. Total discretionary spending request, $2.2 trillion. The defense headline, $1.5 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Of that, $350 billion is being pushed through budget reconciliation, a legislative maneuver that bypasses normal debate and sidelines the opposition entirely. For context, Russia's entire federal budget for 2025 was roughly $450 billion. America is proposing to spend more than 3 times that on defense alone. But the real story isn't the spending, it's what's being cut to pay for it. Civilian agencies face reductions of 10 to 20% across the board. Environmental programs gutted, social services slashed. The traditional civilian state is being systematically dismantled to concentrate resources on a coercive foreign policy. And then there are the tariffs, 50% on steel and aluminum. This isn't market protection, it's preparation. The United States has already become the world's 3rd largest steel producer. The industrial base is being rebuilt not for peacetime prosperity, but for protracted conflict. Your tax dollars, the ones that used to fund schools, roads, and health programs, are now the financial backbone of geopolitical aggression. But here's the question nobody in Washington seems to be asking. What is all this force actually buying? The United States has no peer competitor in conventional military terms. China's Navy is growing, yes, but remains primarily a regional force. Russia's military has been systematically degraded in Ukraine. Iran has no air force worth mentioning. So why $1.5 trillion? The answer is in how Washington now defines power. This isn't a defense budget, it's a coercion budget. The financial infrastructure for a foreign policy built entirely on ultimatums and on monetizing chaos itself. Which brings us to Taiwan. While the world was watching the Hormuz crisis, a different kind of deal was unfolding across the Pacific. Taiwan, facing the permanent threat of Chinese invasion and increasingly uncertain about American reliability, made a calculated bet. $250 billion. That's the investment Taipei committed to American semiconductor manufacturing, building chip fabs on U.S. soil, transferring technology, creating American jobs. In exchange, a tariff reduction of up to 15% on Taiwanese goods. Think about the structure of that deal. Taiwan isn't paying for protection in any traditional sense. It's not a defense treaty. It's not a security guarantee. It's a transaction, cash for consideration. Taiwan essentially purchased a 15% discount on American trade barriers by agreeing to build America's chip industry for it. This is what America First looks like in practice. The United States has abandoned its role as the global policeman, the benevolent hegemon that maintained order because order itself was valuable. Instead, it has become what I call a selfish mega player, a nation that treats every relationship as a profit center, every alliance as a protection racket, every crisis as an extraction opportunity. But here's the trap Washington doesn't seem to see. By abandoning the policeman role, America has created a vacuum that constrains everyone, including itself. Look at China's position. Beijing and Moscow both vetoed the UN resolution that would have affirmed Iran's right to control the Strait of Hormuz. They did it to oppose American influence, to prove the U.S. couldn't dictate international maritime law. It was a clever diplomatic move at the time. Now the United States itself has closed the strait. American warships are blocking passage, seizing vessels, creating the very obstruction China and Russia claim to oppose. And China cannot legally condemn it. Having vetoed the resolution affirming free passage, Beijing has no standing to complain when passage is denied. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is suffocating. 20 million barrels per day. That's the estimated shortfall. China's strategic petroleum reserve covers maybe 90 days. After that, factories go dark. This is the paradox of the selfish mega player. By abandoning principles for pure transaction, America has trapped its competitors in their own cynicism. But America is equally trapped. It can't back down without looking weak. It can't escalate without triggering global economic collapse. It can't negotiate when no one trusts its word. Everyone is stuck, and the global economy is paying for it. Now, let's cross the Atlantic, because what's happening in Europe may be the most underreported story of 2026. NATO, the most successful military alliance in human history, is dying, not from external attack, from internal abandonment. Trump has publicly called the alliance a paper tiger and a disappointment, threatening full U.S. withdrawal. The trigger? European refusal to support military operations against Iran. Two cases that show the collapse in real time. France. When Paris refused to allow American aircraft to transit French airspace carrying supplies to Israel, Trump launched a sustained personal attack on Macron, mocking him publicly, calling his leadership useless. Spain. When Prime Minister Sanchez refused to allow American forces to use Spanish bases for strikes on Iran, the response was immediate and absolute. Total trade termination threatened against a NATO ally. Trump's characterization. Spain has terrible leadership and gives nothing to the U.S. except beautiful people. Sanchez's response was three words that have become the rallying cry of European resistance. No a la guerra. No to war. Here's what American policymakers don't seem to understand. Spain and France aren't opposing the United States out of weakness. They've run the numbers. The cost of following Washington now exceeds the cost of defying it. That calculation is the death certificate of Pax Americana. And Europe isn't just resisting, it's preparing. The Danish model of direct military industrial financing is spreading across the EU. Brussels is building plans for autonomous defense capabilities, not just against threats from the East, but against unpredictability from across the Atlantic. For the first time in 70 years, European defense planners are asking, what if America itself becomes the problem? The Orbán collapse accelerated all of this. April 12, 2026, the same day Islamabad failed. Orbán had ruled Hungary for 16 years, building what he proudly called an illiberal democracy. He was Trump's closest ideological ally in Europe. The proof? Vance flew to Budapest personally just days before the election to endorse him. The result was catastrophic. Péter Magyar's Tisza party won 138 of 199 parliamentary seats, a constitutional supermajority. Voter turnout exceeded 79%. And here's the darkest irony. Vance's visit may have sealed Orbán's fate. Nothing mobilizes voters quite like the perception that a foreign power is interfering in their election. The Vice President of the United States standing next to an unpopular autocrat days before the vote. That's not support. That's a target on his back. Orbán wasn't just a Hungarian politician. He was a proof of concept. Evidence that you could be an EU member, a NATO ally, and Kremlin-friendly all at once. His failure kills the theory that right-wing populism is the inevitable future of Western politics. The Budapest model that American conservatives championed is finished. Now let's talk about Ukraine and the moral void at the center of American foreign policy. In Miami, negotiations continue over what's being called the 28-point plan. Details are still emerging, but the broad strokes are clear. Territorial concessions to Russia, abandonment of Ukraine's NATO membership aspirations, and a mechanism for using $100 billion in frozen Russian assets. not to rebuild Ukraine, but as leverage in the deal itself. This is what peace looks like when your mediator has no principles. Washington isn't brokering a settlement, it's forcing capitulation on Kiev while extracting financial benefit from the process. The frozen Russian assets, money seized specifically because of Russian aggression, may end up greasing a deal that rewards that aggression. I've covered enough conflicts to know that peace often requires painful compromises. But there is a difference between compromise and betrayal. When your allies can no longer tell the two apart in your policies, you've lost something no military budget can buy back. Which brings us to the Vatican, and the strangest subplot of this entire crisis. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope in history, publicly criticized what he called the idolatry of self in American leadership. The Vatican, usually cautious in its political statements, directly condemned the course toward war with Iran. The president's response? He called the pope very liberal and suggested that without his return to the White House, an American would never have become pope. The conflict has since escalated beyond words. AI-generated images depicting Trump as Jesus Christ have spread widely on social media, shared by supporters as expressions of devotion. The Catholic Church condemned them as blasphemous. Suddenly, a geopolitical conflict became a theological one. The Catholic electorate in the United States is deeply divided. Traditionalist Catholics who backed Trump on social issues now face a direct confrontation between their president and their pope. Progressive Catholics see exactly what they always suspected, and the rest of the world watches as America loses its claim to be a defender of Christian values. This is the moral collapse at the heart of transactional politics. When everything is a deal, nothing is sacred. When everyone is a debtor, no one commands respect. America isn't just losing allies, it's losing the moral vocabulary that made alliance possible in the first place. Now let's talk about what ordinary Americans are actually feeling. Since the Hormuz blockade began, U.S. gas prices have risen 38%. The national average is approaching $5 a gallon. In some states, it's already past that. March inflation came in at 3.26%. Well above the Fed's target. And this is before the full effects of the blockade have worked through the system. Europe is facing something potentially worse. A shortfall of 20 million barrels per day has created a jet fuel crisis, just as summer travel season begins. The Eurozone has already committed 680 billion euros to energy subsidies. That's money that won't go to defense, infrastructure, or social programs. The threat of fuel rationing, something not seen since the 1970s, is now being openly discussed in Brussels. Here's the historical parallel that should terrify every policymaker. We may be entering a decade of stagflation. Not recession alone, that would be manageable. Not inflation alone, that could be addressed. But both together, feeding each other, creating a trap with no easy exit. Goldman Sachs now puts the probability of an American recession by year end at 30%. But that estimate was made before the full implications of the blockade became clear. The real number may be higher. And here's the consequence almost no one is talking about. The Hormuz crisis has exposed the absolute fragility of Europe's decarbonization strategy. By rejecting Russian pipeline gas in favor of LNG, Europe made itself completely dependent on secure sea lanes. That dependency was supposed to reduce vulnerability, diversifying away from a single authoritarian supplier. Instead, it created a new vulnerability, dependence on maritime routes Europe cannot defend. And that security has now been destroyed not by Russia, not by Iran, but by the United States. The American Navy, supposed to guarantee freedom of navigation, has become the force denying it. So where does this leave us? What we're watching in the first half of 2026 is not a series of disconnected events. It's a cascade. Each decision triggers consequences that constrain the next, creating a doom loop of escalation and isolation. Tariffs on steel lead to Allied resentment. Allied resentment reduces cooperation on Iran. Reduced cooperation produces the Islamabad failure. Islamabad triggers the Hormuz blockade. The blockade creates an energy crisis. The energy crisis drives inflation. Inflation increases recession risk. Recession risk creates political instability in allied nations. Instability accelerates European autonomy. European autonomy reduces American leverage. Reduced leverage produces more aggressive unilateralism, and the cycle repeats. The paradox at the center of this spiral is what I call the vulnerability of overwhelming power. The United States has the military capacity to do almost anything, but exercising that capacity carries costs, diplomatic, economic, moral, that America cannot bear alone. A $1.5 trillion defense budget means nothing if your allies won't host your bases. Naval dominance means nothing if using it crashes your own economy. Nuclear superiority means nothing if the threat isn't credible. The Taiwan deal shows the new reality. Allies don't follow anymore. They negotiate. They pay tribute, $250 billion worth, for temporary consideration. Real power comes from relationships, from trust, from the belief by other nations that working with you serves their interests. When that belief dies, all you have left is coercion. And coercion at global scale is not sustainable. The November midterms are coming. Republican control of Congress is genuinely threatened by $5 gas and rising prices. The EU is accelerating plans for autonomous security architecture. China is trapped by its own UN veto, watching its economy suffocate while unable to condemn the blockade it helped enable. Russia watches the West tear itself apart over disputes that have nothing to do with Moscow. And the Vatican has declared American leadership morally bankrupt. I started this analysis asking how one chain of decisions brought down the old world order. The answer, I think, is simpler than we'd like it to be. The old world order wasn't brought down. It was given away, discarded, treated as a cost rather than an asset, sold off for short-term gains that never materialized. Here's what $1.5 trillion can buy you: aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, missile defense systems, the most advanced military hardware ever built, submarines that are useless in shallow water, tariffs that push your allies away, a trade war with nations you depend on. Here's what $1.5 trillion cannot buy you: the belief by other nations that your leadership serves their interests. That is earned over decades through consistent behavior, and it can be destroyed in months. This is the anatomy of impotence. Not weakness, impotence. The possession of great power without the ability to use it productively. The capacity to destroy without the capacity to build. The means to threaten, but not to persuade. The wealth to buy transactions, but not trust. April 2026 will be remembered as the month the American century ended. Not with a bang, with an ultimatum that nobody accepted. And the bill for that ultimatum? We're all going to pay it. At the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the jobs that disappear when the recession hits, in the wars that follow when the old order's guardrails are finally gone. This is what happens when a superpower decides it would rather be feared than trusted. It ends up being neither.